This is Questions of Courage, a podcast from the youth section at the Goetheanum, hosted by Nathaniel Williams.
Welcome to Questions of Courage. I'd like to dedicate the session today to talk about the inauguration of a new president and administration in the United States of America, and reflect on the inauguration itself and also the speech that was delivered at the inauguration. And I don't want to do this in a narrow way, just looking back at political campaigns or party platforms that everyone is very familiar with, but to look in a bigger way at what's developing in the United States and to try to understand maybe how we've gotten here, and also what's the significance, how we can relate to what's going on in the United States. And I know people all around the world were watching and are watching what's unfolding in the United States, because the United States is one of the most influential and powerful, if not the most influential and powerful country right now, though that is changing in ways in the last decades. And so many people are trying to make sense of what's going on and also try to find their own relationship. What is it asking of us? How can we respond to what's developing? And I think many people might be surprised when they hear the speech at the inauguration, that it suggested that there's a revolution of common sense, and at the same time to feel that this common sense doesn't seem to be really connected to science and technology and the things that many people might really associate with common sense, scientific rationality. And in an age where science has made such progress and technology has made such progress, how can we talk about a need for a revolution of common sense the way that it was done at the inauguration? Now, at the inauguration, common sense was spoken about like we need a revolution of nationalism in the United States. More nationalism, more pride in the cultural norms and history of the nation. And also there needs to be a kind of encouragement of national industrialization, extraction of natural resources, and economic competition with other states and nations around the world. And these were some of the qualities, and oriented towards kind of strengthening the material prosperity of the United States, consumerism. These were some of the things that clearly came through the inauguration, though of course that's not everything that was spoken of. But it's what I'd like to focus on, and for reasons that will become clear in just a few minutes. Now, when we look back, though, over the last 100 years, and I'm going to speak pretty broadly about this, but it can allow us to see something. In the last 100, 200 years, people who have tried to make sense of society, and philosophers, sociologists, from really, really different directions, many of them see a conflict between a kind of reason or rationality and kind of common sense. And given in philosophy, these terms are in the academy, when you study also different thinkers, they mean different things when they're used by different people in different ways. But I would like to ask you to let's turn towards it with some generosity of spirit and imagine that there is something common here for a moment. And if we look at, for instance, Max Weber, who suggested that one of the great tendencies of modern society is kind of tendency towards increased rationalization, where more and more people are kind of playing specialized roles in a cooperative logical network, high degree of social specialization, kind of the qualities of creative individuality, of autonomy in that sense are challenged. And this is something that's intrinsically connected with modernity. So kind of reason that in a way it asks the individual to insert themselves in a big rational network of modern society. So a little bit anti-individualistic in a way. We can look at Hannah Arendt, a very different thinker. Hannah Arendt, in her work, at different periods of her work, she approached this question differently, but one of her most beautiful works, which is The Human Condition, she makes a differentiation between a kind of thinking that can really take account of living on the earth, in different regions of the earth, and having connections with different people, and living the good life of the earth, and what she called a kind of rationality which is abstract, which can't really connect with the values of let's say, social and political life. And she called these two extraterrestrial and terrestrial reason. Now, extraterrestrial, she got from the fact that this kind of reason, she identified it as developing through modern astronomy and the revolution in astronomy, when there were models that postulated the sun as the center of a solar system. And this kind of thinking in mathematical models, pure kind of abstract thoughts, is a kind of reason or a kind of rationality that doesn't really accommodate the common human experience, that in a way can negate, can oppress, can subdue many of the things that we might feel are very valuable in human life. And her tension between vita contemplativa and vita activa, we also find something of this. Vita activa is kind of the active life, the virtue of the active life, and also political life in her case. And being able to experience virtue through rhetoric together and speech together. And so I can't go into more detail with her, but we also see then in the New Left, again, a group of people that are totally different from Max Weber and from Hannah Arendt. When we read, for instance, Horkheimer and Adorno and the dialectic of the Enlightenment, they point out that there's this kind of reason that the Enlightenment developed in Europe, 16th, 17th century, and that it unfolded in such a way that it has begun to become a kind of influence, turning all of human life and all of society into pure forms of functional operation. And not only through science, but through the organization of modern economy and capitalist economy. Of course, Adorno and Horkheimer are coming from the left. They're coming from a communist perspective, but not in the same way as Marx, very different in certain respects. But they also are concerned with this kind of thinking, this kind of expert rationality that could remake the whole world and lose somehow something that was existentially human. And we don't only find it then in the left, but if we look at the neoconservatives in the United States and how they kind of recognize a similar threat coming from the economic-oriented rationality that, for instance, Adorno and Horkheimer are criticizing. They suggest that a return to religion and to past conservative values is absolutely necessary if the decadence of the society in the United States as a symbol, one of the great symbols of modern society, is not going to just fall deeper and deeper into decadence. So we see from sociology, one of the founders like Max Weber, a phenomenology, Hannah Arendt, New Left thought, just with Adorno and Horkheimer as examples, or the neoconservative thought in the United States, examples, all of them aware of a kind of thinking, a kind of reason that is at odds with a kind of human scale experience of the individual human being, certain types of freedom, of values that are connected with this. And so in a way, a kind of expert, disciplined rationality that is highly developed, a conflict with common sense. And, it's interesting to listen to the inauguration and to just look back over the last couple decades in the United States, bearing this in mind, trying to keep a little bit of a distance of the American, polemics, the political polemics, and try to understand a little bit on a deeper level some of the things that are happening. And when we do that, we see one of the things that happen is that establishment politicians in the left and in the right, so I know the United States left, the progressive, is very centrist for many people around the world, but the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, they have really been marginalized through populist movements. Now, the incoming administration in the United States, but when we look back to Bernie Sanders' movement, there was something similar at play which didn't lead to a political seat of power. But a kind of revolution is underway in some sense. And when we look back over the last decades in the United States, and we keep an eye out for this, and why is it that in the United States, a majority of people voted for this really radical change and stand behind this idea of a revolution in common sense, or feel there's something meaningful in it? I mean, we can start with really basic observations. Consider most of the commodities that we use every day. If I really ask, do I know what this is made of, and do I know how to dispose of it, I might not be able to answer. Think about forever chemicals or forever plastics. Our connection with things that we're using, be they wrapping or even disposable cups that we might get when we drink coffee, or we don't even necessarily know what the materiality is and how to take care of it, how to take responsibility for it. It's a highly specialized process now, even the production of really basic commodities or goods. Or we could look at the other end of the spectrum, the most high-tech commodity that many of us are using, which are these supercomputers, which some guys called smartphones, even though there's not really phoning is really their primary use. They are really supercomputers, but they're small, and they kind of transformed as used to be like a phone, but now it's just a supercomputer that I can fit in my hand, do all kinds of things on. Almost no one understands the materials that they're made out of, how they're produced. There's a high level of, there's a big gap between what this ingenious rationality, technological, instrumental rationality can achieve, and my own understanding as a person who is engaging with it a lot of my day and using it. This gap between expertise and common sense is very, very big. But we can also look at something like a social system. Look at the economy. Look at about 15, 20 years ago, the financial crisis that had effects all over the world, but in the United States it was a big deal. And the fact that in the financial sector, decisions were made and things were done, which led to a huge disappearance of wealth that had been calculated with. And I don't want to go into the specifics of how that happened or comment on that, but the experience of many people was that they worked sometimes for decades to achieve a certain value, and they did it working jobs that were of service to the greater community that they could be proud of, and that through the process of the financial crisis, they lost value. And then they saw how experts, economic experts at the highest levels, and politicians decided to take tax money and to give it to the financial institutions, and in some cases the individuals who had been involved in this crisis. And there we see science, economic science, and I intentionally put it in quotation marks in relationship to modern economics. We see it and the conflict with common sense. I mean, for some, it was truly excruciatingly existential to see all the money going towards bankers and people in the financial sector to make good on their mistakes, and to hear that it was a necessity at the same time while they saw their honest earned income disappear, or their equity, for instance, maybe in their property. That's an example of a gap between kind of an expert rationality and common sense. Another one was experienced by many in the pandemic of the corona pandemic. And when we look back in the United States, for instance, experts were demanding that people isolate from their family members at the moment of death, that they couldn't be with their family members and take care of them and spend that moment with them when they passed. And we have to keep in mind that in the United States, I know this is quite different from many countries in Europe, the majority of people are either religious, that means they are oriented towards a belief in something spiritual, they mean different things by that, of course, or spiritually oriented in a kind of more, maybe we might say, New Age fashion, and that they would be told that it was absolutely necessary that they not be with their loved ones and care for them at the moment of death, which is in some ways connected with some of the deepest values of human life for many people, and that this was necessary due to public health realities and the dangers of this virus. I think that, of course, we see that most people and many people complied, but I think that the fact that the experience in the United States for many people was that, a lot of public health officials really didn't relate to the spiritual concerns of people who sincerely live with an openness towards spirituality. And so there's like this gap between how people live their lives, how they think about life, how they think about caring for one another, being for one another, and a kind of public health culture and rationalization that explained to them the necessity of their acting really in contradiction with their own values. And I'm sure that many people live with really significant memories, probably some difficult memories, having gone through that and maybe complied with certain laws that they now regret. But be that as it may, my point is there's this kind of very, very developed expertise culture in public health and how it played itself out recently in the pandemic. Also related to closing down schools and what that meant for children or mental health. So let's just say there's another instance of conflict everyone's quite familiar with. And now we see, for instance, there was a nomination of Robert Kennedy Jr., who, as a director of the Department of Health in the United States, an individual who has really developed an image as an outsider and also an opponent of kind of the established orientations to public health that are maybe experienced in this field of tension with common sense. But, so there we have like the economy, we have public health, but we can move on to the military in the United States, which is really such an important part when you really get down to the reality of some of the expenditures and orientations of the federal government. About one sixth of the federal budget of the United States is military. It is, of course, one of the main responsibilities of the federal government. 800 military bases around the world. And in recent decades, there have been military operations in 85 countries. Now, some of these are small. They're called anti-terrorist operations. But let's just say it's 85 sovereign countries. And the thing is that most citizens in the United States don't know that. They're not aware of that. And so you can see also this feeling of disconnect between a kind of almost like a expert military organization that is working in secret committees with Congress members and military officials, spending huge amounts of money. Just look at the recent war in Afghanistan and really the tragedy of the recent war in Afghanistan in some ways. And a lot of people in the United States feel, here again, we have a gap between common sense and this kind of experts that seem to always know what's best. But also somehow feel like they're out of touch. And then we have the intelligence agencies in the United States. And, well, first of all, when we look at the new president, some of the things that I think some people, at least since seeing this individual come into power, is that he might have a different attitude towards war and towards empire and imperialism. And so maybe they're hopeful at, what is going to be possible through this political presidency. And when we come to the intelligence agencies, in the United States, it's known through the declassification of certain documents, but there are also a lot of speculations about how the intelligence agencies, the CIA, to some extent the FBI, work to shape the common sense of citizens of the United States through their efforts, and sometimes maybe even engage in domestic terrorism. And there are instances where this is clearly known. The biggest suspicions, though, in the United States that appeared again in the first week of the new inauguration of this president have to do with very, very high-profile murders or assassinations. One in connection to Martin Luther King Jr., and another in connection to John F. Kennedy. And there are, if you look, for instance, at a book by William Pepper, An Act of the State, which details kind of questions around Martin Luther King Jr.'s death, or if you look at James W. Douglas and his JFK and the Unspeakable, you can find a book that contains a lot of the concerns of many people within the United States about the involvement of a kind of expert shadow intelligence decisions in relationship to common sense and democracy, really. So, this one way to characterize the rationality that many social theorists and philosophers and political theorists have been concerned with is a kind of thinking where it takes a high degree of abstraction, often turning things into functions, quantifiable functions or formal mathematical functions, and assigning a phenomena like a person or a certain part of a model of matter or movement of a star or a comet in the sky with a certain number, and trying to think about the whole world, every phenomena connected with a function, as one big machine that somehow is all tied together. This is one of the leading kind of styles of thinking connected with this form of rationality. And when we think about knowledge, often we think it's neutral. We think about the world and then we can decide what we want to do. And that what we do, that's really what defines us morally. But the concern that a lot of thinkers and social theorists have had is that how we think is connected to how we are oriented towards acting, how we will act ethically. And so there's already in how we think a kind of ethical dimension, a value dimension. And in all of these examples that I've characterized, these are kind of examples where I think on a feeling level, one way to look at this unrest really in the United States is this deep feeling among people in the US that there's this orientation to our scientific culture and our technological culture that is unconsciously, maybe some consciously, some unconsciously, turning everything into a grand system that really oppresses autonomy and freedom. And so we can live with that as a possibility. Now, when we talk about common sense, some people may take offense at so much emphasis on common sense, the importance of common sense. But when we're talking about a democratic country, there's no way around it. Democracy is oriented towards a belief that the judgment of common people is sufficient to create at least a legislative state of agreements that has some endurance. The United States is a democracy. It's a democratic republic. So it's not all radical democracy, as some say. I'm not going to go into that right now. You have to talk about common sense when you talk about democracy. Demos comes from the word for the people. So democracy is rule of the people. And so in some ways, what we can see playing out in the United States, it's connected with a democratic country, and one where there's a tension between a kind of, maybe an unconscious tension between the form of rationality in that country and specialization and expert cultures and democratic common sense and a feeling of autonomy. Now, this is another way to look at this, is to think about, we talk about things like social theory and philosophy, and I've referred to what I would call some pretty expensive theorists. They've developed very, very nuanced concepts in different areas. But really, the majority of people, they don't even ever read social theory. And I don't mean that as a criticism. Most of us live in what we should rather call social imaginations, not social theories. And indeed, in political science, there's a conscious approach to talking about social imaginaries instead of social theories. Many people live with kind of instinctive, stylistic orientations and imaginations that really guide their lives and their access through more imaginative icons and stories and pictures than theories. And in a democracy, I think one has to talk about social imaginations in a way that gives them probably more importance in some ways than social theories, in some regards, because it's really what the life of society is imbued with, imaginations. And when we think about common sense and social imaginations, in general, where do we find common sense? Where do we find social imaginaries? It's where we work. It's where we live. It's when we go home. It's when we tell one another stories that have some kind of deeper meaning in them. It's these kind of human scale experience of being a creature, among other social creatures on the earth, is imbued with kind of pictorial, imaginative experience with one another. And also, these are traverse. There's like ethical feelings and values that move through these situations. And that is really kind of the field of common sense. Now, this brings us to a really, I think, one of the most important observations that I would mention till now. And that is that when we look at the situation that we're in right now in regards to common sense, and we look back over the last 70 years, 80 years, we see that there are things happening in this field of common sense that are truly radical. And first of all, we can see it with telephone and television, radio, accelerating just to such an intensity in the last 25 years. It's really hard to characterize appropriately. So now, we have screens and pictures in our field of common sense around us all the time, often interacting with them for hours and hours. You're probably maybe on a supercomputer right now, or television, of course, at least watching or listening to this podcast or vodcast. The field of common sense for many people is full of pictures. And what are these pictures of? They're often, interestingly enough, they're manipulated by commercial interests to control cycles of consumption, to direct cycles of consumption, to manipulate consumption, encourage consumption, advertising. A lot of the algorithms that are currently at work online are connected to this kind of movement, but also political control, as we know from Cambridge Analytica, but also just basic political influence campaigns in public politics. a lot of effort is put into using technology to control and influence our imagination, this common sense, so to say, this field of common sense, which is accessible to everyone who can see and can hear and can speak basic language and understand visual culture. So really available, not highly theoretical, not abstract. So one of the big changes over the last 70 years is that the whole field where we used to really develop common sense is now really a confusing place. And I think when people, like politicians who don't notice some of these tensions between the development of common sense and rationality, some politicians who speak like everything's going well, we've done really great, we're going to just keep pushing the normal party platforms of the last 150 years, it can make an uncanny impression. And we saw this in the United States, and we see it in other places too. It can feel like hollow. It can feel so empty. It can feel out of touch. And at the same time, we have this strange situation now, because we have people, I think, feel instinctively that there is this intelligence that is so developed. Also, they might sense it in what is called artificial intelligence, which is really hyper automation, just a very, very developed kind of machines. But there's a type of thinking that really could swallow qualities of the human being and human society that they feel are absolutely essential. And yet, one of the biggest challenges is that field where we usually would develop and cultivate common sense and understanding is so corrupted in a way through the current uses of visual culture and technology that people are disoriented, terribly disoriented. It's as if, we've been drugged, or people have been drugged. And just as like when you're dreaming at night and you strike out because you think that someone's come in your room, and you could be right. You could be right that someone is in your room and come to hurt you, but you could also strike a friend, and you could also hurt yourself. And there's something of that feeling in this situation where there's a kind of a feeling of a danger coming from a really abstract, techno-scientific type of thinking, and a kind of disorientation on the most basic levels of experience. And now I'd like to ask a question, though. Okay, if that's a kind of diagnosis in a way of one dimension of what's happening right now, what would a revolution of common sense look like, or has looked like, or could look like? Now, this may seem a little bit strange, but if we look at this suggestion that all these different theorists have indicated, that there's a kind of thinking, scientific thinking, that has a kind of value orientation in it, which we could call instrumental reason. I don't want to suggest all of these theorists use that in the same way, but for our purposes today, I'm just going to call it instrumental reason. And this reason really can't accommodate really important things about human experience that common sense can. Well, rationality, you have these kind of general principles, these laws, and from them you can calculate individual instances, like mathematically. You can take general principles and then you can create a calculation and come up with a result which is true. And the individual can be explained through these general laws. So the individual is subsumed by this general abstract reality. Now, if that is a kind of given a kind of caricature, maybe, of reason. On the other hand, what would a complement to that look like? And here I'd like to just point towards an example that I think is really, well, one, it's not very well known, but it's amazing, and the potential in it is truly amazing. And I think if you look at the world situation we're in, I hope to at least indicate why. And it has to do with Goethe. And Goethe is a German literary star figure. Of course, for Faust, the play, but also his novels, his poetry, his beautiful poetry. But he was absolutely at home in his passionate interest in natural science, geology, botany, morphology, also animal morphology, physics and color theory, to name some of the most developed fields of his research. And he developed a kind of method that is really amazing when you look at it in the context of what we've been talking about right now. And that method is as follows. He believed that you could come to an understanding through having an experiment, but not trying to prove a theory, like a mathematical theory, but having an experiment, having a certain, observing a certain thing, and then having the opposite, trying to arrange the conditions of the experiment in the opposite way so that you can make another observation. And to continue to do that until you just had this huge, huge plane or horizon of observations and experiences. And if you were able to order these, to bring them into a serial form of order, at the end, you came to an understanding of these things, which was not a kind of abstract mathematical understanding, but in the end, it was a perception. And this may sound really strange, but he called it the primal phenomenon. In German, the Urphänomen. And the primal phenomena was a perception, something that you could experience qualitatively. And at the same time, if you had been through all of these different experiments, this one phenomenon somehow contained everything that you had experienced experimentally. So it's kind of a totally different picture of science and thinking. One that where you go from individual to individual and you order them, and in the end you come to an understanding in the form of an individual, of a specific perceptible thing. So in the sphere of common sense, I would like to say, in one way. Well, okay, this might seem like a really complicated and abstract way to come at this question, but I just want to point out that recently, not too long ago, there was a study that was published by Dan McCannon, who is a professor at Harvard, and it's called Eco-Alchemy. And one of the outcomes of this book, which was an anthropological study about the influence of anthroposophy on the emerging ecological movement in the United States, one of the most important places for the emergence of the ecological movement, was Goethe's orientation towards science. Because in the anthroposophical movement, there's a very high regard for this approach to science. And that it was connected, this high regard for this orientation in science, that it was connected to being able to articulate and understand the fundamental credo, the core message of the ecological movement, which is the earth, including human beings and human economy, are part of one interconnected living whole. Now, after Goethe lived, it's 100 years ago now, but Rudolf Steiner and Daniel Dunlop and Walter Stein, who I've spoken about in some other sessions, they came up with the ethical dimension of this kind of thinking. So when I was talking about the implicit value, kind of value orientation of instrumental rationality, well, arguably, the intrinsic value orientation in this approach to science that we see in Goethe's work was articulated as something called associative economics, which points towards a voluntary cooperation in economics, in coming to the right values and sharing of things. And I can't say much more about that, but if you look back in previous sessions, you can find a few sessions on associative economics, which explain it a little bit more. And I hope that it's clear. This isn't just like an arbitrary feel-good suggestion, but that they really developed a kind of virtuous action in economics that grew out of gathering together points of view, value judgments in economics in order to come up with true price. And true price was always in harmony with ecological and social conditions of everyone involved in production. So it was like a discovery of the ethical approach intrinsic in modern economics, called associative economics after Rudolf Steiner's associative theories. So I've just indicated what I really believe is a kind of deeper struggle that's going on right now, and namely that in the United States there is a instinctive sense that there's great danger. And one is because we have a kind of scientific culture which is really abstract and oriented towards kind of instrumental technological use, and a kind of common sense world or horizon that is really confused and where we're consciously manipulating people, subconsciously, unconsciously, usually inspired by behavioral psychology, for instance. So I feel like this tension that is now maybe showing itself in tumultuous and developments in the United States, there's something to this in all of that. And there's also something really tragic, is that the education in the United States, which for decades has been really just terrible, where really going to school is more about babysitting and teaching kids how to follow rules than any deep reverence, developing human beings, the capacities that human beings have, which of course play themselves out in society, state, the economy. And so when I talk about public education in the United States, of course I'm talking about this also a certain neglect of developing common sense. But we actually have to look farther beyond the United States and look at the fact that there are certain approaches to knowledge that have been neglected in the Enlightenment of Europe over the last couple hundred years. These are not just concerns of specialist academic circles. I think these are concerns about civilization on all levels. And, when we see the inauguration, turning back towards the inauguration in the United States, when we look at the people that were there, it's like an open secret. I mean, it's like we can read the tension of our moment in that room. We have all of these very, very powerful and wealthy technological oligarchs, and you could use that term, people really with so much power and wealth who are really influencing the common sense of billions of people. And on the other hand, this call for a revolution of common sense through intense national competition, through the extraction of natural resources without ecological consciousness, for a feeling of competition with other nations on a cultural level, then we can really see how starkly this contrasts with what a real revolution in common sense implies. This growing awareness of interdependence on a global level, so above egotistic national groups, and cooperation economically. It's a kind of inverse image of common sense. It's an illusion. And it's one, at the center of this illusion is a really, really dark core. And it was these thoughts that I wanted to share today. Of course, it's just one perspective, but I do believe that it has something essential, or captures something essential of what we're experiencing, not only in the United States, but in many places in the world right now. And I offer it just as a contribution towards being more awake to what's going on and being able to orient what we feel like is important to stand for and to do. Questions of Courage is a collaboration between the youth section and the communications team. Any contribution that you might make will support youth work, the work of youth section work. The development or production costs of Questions of Courage are quite low, and we really do appreciate your support. Thank you.